Hey everybody, Mr. Gibson here. So this assignment is your study guide for the Unit 4 test. And so what I'm going to do with this video is simply go over the questions and how maybe I would answer some of these questions. So hopefully by the time you're watching this video, you will have already finished the study guide. And this is simply so that you can check your answers. Now I'm going to go through a little bit fast so that the video isn't super long. But the perks of a video is you can always pause it and go back if you need to re-listen to something that I said. And if you're just checking your answer and not having to type them for the first time, which is the purpose of the video, is that you're just checking your answers. It's a lot faster to just tweak them a little bit than it is to go back and type them for the first time. So let's go ahead and open this up and see what's going on with this study guide. Now I'm not going to type the answers in so that I don't mess with the this template for the study guide here. So just again, if I say something too fast for you typing, just pause it, go back and listen to it again. So it says describe where each of the three subatomic particles are within an atom. Which two are located in the nucleus, and which particle is found in the area that surrounds the nucleus? So the three subatomic particles in an atom are protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay, those are the three subatomic particles that make up every single atom. The protons and the neutrons, protons are positive, neutrons are neutral. Those two subatomic particles are found in the nucleus of the atom. So they're all bunched together in the center of the atom. We call them nucleus. The electron is found in the area surrounding the nucleus. We actually call that the electron cloud, and they are orbiting the protons and neutrons in the nucleus. So protons, neutrons, nucleus, electrons are surrounding the nucleus. Number two, in which directions on the periodic table does ionization energy increase? So within a group and within a period. Remember that a group is a vertical column. Okay, so in a group, up and down on the periodic table, ionization increases as we go up on the periodic table. Okay, so the element at the top of the group would have the highest ionization energy. And going from left to right in a period again, remember it's just a horizontal row on the periodic table, ionization energy increases as we go to the right. So the way I always memorized it is ionization energy increases up and to the right on the periodic table. All right. Number three, which directions on the periodic table does electron affinity increase in a group and in a period? Well, electron affinity has the same trends as ionization energy, so it also increases up and to the right, with the only exception being the noble gases. The noble gases do not, that far right column, starting with helium going all the way down, does not have electron affinity, okay? Because electron affinity is how much an atom wants to gain an electron, and noble gases are stable, so they don't ever want to gain an electron. But other than that, the trend is the same as ionization energy, up and to the right, okay? Number four, in which directions on the periodic table does electronegativity increase? Again, the same as electron affinity and ionization energy. Electronegativity increases going up in a group and to the right within a period or a horizontal row. And it's similar to electron affinity in that this also does not apply to the noble gases. Electronegativity is a quality for basically how much an atom will want to pull electrons closer to itself when it's in a compound with another atom, and noble gases don't ever form compounds because they're stable. So electronegativity increases up and to the right with the exception of the noble gases. Okay. Number five, in which directions on the periodic table does the atomic radius increase within a group and a period? So atomic radius is the exact opposite of the other trends that we've talked about. Atomic radius increases down a group. So as you go down a group, the element gets bigger. And as you go to the left, on the periodic table, the atom gets bigger. So atomic radius increases down and to the left. All right. Number six, neutral atoms have the same number of which particles? So when we call an atom neutral, what we mean to say is that it's electrically neutral, meaning that all of its positive charges are the same as all of its negative charged particles. So the positively charged particle is the proton. The negatively charged particle is the electron. So for an atom to be neutral, it must have the same number of protons and electrons. All right. Number 7, which group or vertical column of metals is the most reactive? So what you're looking for here is which group of metals has the least number of valence electrons, because that the number of valence electrons is what a metal will lose when it is reacting. So the fewer valence electrons it has, the easier it will react. And the column of metals that has the highest reactivity or the fewest number of valence electrons is the very first column. So that's, I've got a periodic table up here is what I'm looking up. You've got hydrogen, lithium, potassium, sodium, rubidium, cesium, and francium. All of those guys, also called the alkali metals, are the most reactive metals. Okay. Number 8, here we've got a section of the periodic table. It says, which element on this section of the periodic table has the highest ionization energy? Remember, ionization energy increases up and to the right. So fluorine will have the highest ionization energy. Highest electronegativity, same thing. It'll be fluorine because electronegativity has the same trend as ionization energy. Highest electron affinity, same trend as the first two. It's going to be, so it's up and to the right. So fluorine would have the highest. And it says the largest atomic radius. So remember, atomic radius is the opposite of the other trends. An atom gets bigger, its radius gets larger as you go to the left within a period and as you go down a group. So gallium would have the largest atomic radius. All right, number 9, what are some characteristics we use to identify elements? There's a variety of things you could put for this answer. You could have put the number of protons, which is how we distinguish basically every element from another element. You could say number of electrons, number of neutrons. You could talk about the different groups that it's in, whether it's an alkali metal or an alkaline earth metal or a halogen or a noble gas. You can talk about whether or not it's a metal, non-metal, or metalloid. We can also use all the trends, the ionization energy, electronegativity, atomic radius, all that stuff to distinguish different elements from each other. So there's a variety of things you can put for number 9. Number 10, where in an atom is the majority of the mass located? Well, the majority of the mass is located in the nucleus. So protons and neutrons, while very light, very small particles, are way more massive or have way more, I guess we could say, they weigh way more. They have more weight than electrons do. Electrons weigh 1 out of 1,840 the mass of a proton, where protons and neutrons relatively weigh the same. So the mass is mostly located in the nucleus because the electrons weigh, next to nothing. Okay. Number 11, how does the radius of a positive ion, or a cation is another name for that, compare to that of the neutral version of the atom? Okay, so when an atom has become a positive ion, that means it has lost an electron, which is kind of backwards. You don't think of losing making something positive, but in this case, remember, electrons are negative. So if an atom is neutral, it has the same number of electrons and protons. If you remove an electron, now it's going to have more protons than it does electrons, making it positive. Okay, so because it's lost an electron to become a positive ion, that means its radius will actually get smaller. So how does the radius of a cation compare to that of the neutral version of the atom? The radius is smaller in a cation than when that atom is neutral. Okay, number 12, how does the radius of a negative ion, or an anion, compare to that of the neutral version of the atom? Well, a negative ion is negative because it has gained an electron. So now if it's gained an electron, it has more particles with negative charges than it has protons, which have a positive charge. So that makes it negative. And when it gains electrons, it causes the atomic radius to increase because now the atom has gained a subatomic particle. So how does the radius of a negative ion compare to that of the neutral atom? The radius of the anion is larger than the neutral atom. Okay. Number 13, which macromolecule is produced during photosynthesis? Okay, so photosynthesis is where plants take carbon dioxide and water and use sunlight to make glucose and oxygen, which is a byproduct. But glucose is the important one for this question. So what macromolecule is glucose? Well, glucose is a carbohydrate. It's a sugar molecule. So the macromolecule produced during photosynthesis is carbohydrates, specifically glucose. Number 14, what elements make up carbohydrates? Sugars. Okay, so remember, carbohydrates and sugars are synonyms, and I wanted to point that out in that question. They mean the same thing. And all carbohydrates or sugars are made up of the same three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Remember, CHO. And they're always in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Number 15, describe the process of cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is where a glucose molecule and an oxygen go through a chemical reaction. Those bonds between the elements in those molecules are broken and rearranged into carbon dioxide and water. Okay, and that process is what allows it. Breaking those chemical bonds allows us to make energy in the form of ATP. But the process itself is where glucose and oxygen, those bonds are broken and those atoms are rearranged into new products, carbon dioxide and water, and we get energy. Number 16, if students place a single-celled organisms into a container with a glucose solution, which is just glucose dissolved in water, what would happen to the amount of glucose over time? So every living thing on the planet, pretty much, at least for the purposes of right now, for this class, needs glucose in order to do cellular respiration to make energy. So if you were to take these single-celled organisms, okay, and you're going to put it in a container full of glucose, it's going to use that glucose to make energy. So what's going to happen to the glucose over time? Well, the glucose is going to decrease because it's being used up. It's being, you can maybe think of it as being digested. It's being used for cellular respiration by those organisms. So glucose would decrease over time. What happened to the population of the single-celled organisms? Well, you've got all these organisms that have a ton of glucose around them. This is a feeding frenzy. They now have this glucose buffet, so their population is going to increase. So over time, the glucose would go down, and the population of the single-celled organisms would go up, okay, because they have all that free food, basically. Number 17, provide the evidence that organisms use and repurpose elements, specifically carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, found within macromolecules for new cells. Okay, so I want you to think about this. What are the three most common elements in every macromolecule, which makes up the food that we eat? You've got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, CHO. They're in all of them. They're in carbs, lipids, proteins. They're in nucleic acids, but we don't eat those. Well, we technically do, but we don't. Yeah, we get our nutrients from proteins, lipids, and carbs. Okay, and so the dominant elements in those, the most predominant, are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now I want you to think: what are the most common elements in the cells in your body? It's also carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So you are made of the same things that the macromolecules are made of. So that is a really big piece of evidence. This idea that the same elements make up the majority of these molecules are the same elements that make up the majority of us and the structures within our bodies is evidence that we're getting those elements from these macromolecules, from these food sources, and repurposing them or recombining them into the structures we need for our body. Okay. Number 18, what do carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules have to combine with in order to form nucleotides? So think about the structure of a nucleotide. You've got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but remember, a nucleotide is the monomer for nucleic acids. So part of every nucleotide is something called a phosphate molecule, which is named after the element phosphorus. So not only do you have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but those atoms must also bond to phosphorus. So that's one thing that they have to combine with to form a nucleotide. Something else they have to combine with is something called a nitrogen base, and that's our A, T, C, and G that we're used to thinking of when we think of DNA. And guess what element is in a nitrogen base? Well, you've got CHO, but you also have nitrogen. So those are the two other things, phosphorus and nitrogen, that carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen must combine with in order to form a nucleic acid. Number 19, what ingredients are needed for an organism to make a protein? So as far as the building blocks of a protein go, we need amino acids, and that's why we have to get some of those from our diet. That's why we need foods with protein in them, so we can get those amino acids to make proteins in our cells. But as far as, like, if you want to zoom in even closer, what makes up the amino acids? Well, you've got to have molecules with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and nitrogen, okay? Because nitrogen is in proteins, okay? It's got CHO, just like every macromolecule, but it also has nitrogen, and some proteins have sulfur, Okay, there are 2 amino acids that have sulfur. So those are some of the ingredients we also need in order to make proteins. Number 20, what do foods that are made up of carbohydrates why do foods that are made up of carbohydrates have so little sugar listed on the nutrition label? So anything plant-based that you're going to eat is pretty much entirely carbohydrates. Now, there are some oils found in plants, so there are lipids, and some plants have protein in them, but the vast majority of any plant-based food is carbohydrates, because that's what all of their cells are made out of, is cellulose. And that's what brings me to the answer to this question. So if you eat a piece of broccoli or a piece of celery, if you're to look at a nutrition label for the container that was in, it's going to show very little amounts of usable sugar, even though almost 100% of that thing that you're eating is carbohydrates. That's because there are really complex carbohydrates that we cannot digest. One that we can digest is starch. So that's the complex carbohydrate we get from pasta and bread and potatoes. We have no problem breaking down starch into the monomers like glucose and then using those for cellular respiration to make energy. But then you have this the molecule that all plant cells are made out of is called cellulose. And that's a really complex carbohydrate, similar to starch, but it's formatted a little bit differently. And because of that, we don't have the enzymes to digest cellulose. So you could have a food that is almost completely 100% made of carbohydrates, meaning that it's made of cellulose, but it's not going to list that as usable sugar on the back of the nutrition label because we can't get any nutrients out of cellulose. Okay. Number 21, what is a monomer and a polymer of carbohydrates? Well, the monomer of a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one, saccharide meaning sugar. Some examples of that would be glucose and fructose. A polymer of carbohydrates is called a polysaccharide. Poly meaning many, so it's many sugars. And examples of that would be starch or cellulose, like we talked about. Number 2, what is a monomer and a polymer of proteins? The monomer of a protein is called an amino acid. The polymer of a protein, you can just call it a protein. A fancier name for it might be a polypeptide chain because it's got those peptide bonds that hold the amino acids together. But you can, most cases, you'll see people just refer to proteins as the polymer. Number 23, what is the monomer and polymer of nucleic acids? The monomer of a nucleic acid is called a nucleotide. So that's what the building block that makes up your nucleic acids. A polymer of nucleic acids would just be a nucleic acid. And there are some examples. 2 big ones in your body would be DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, ribonucleic acid. Number 24, what is the primary purpose of carbohydrates? The primary purpose of carbs is they are your main energy source to make ATP or to make energy in your cells. Okay, they're the main source by which we can do our cells, or specifically our mitochondria, can do cellular respiration, break down those carbs like glucose to make energy in the form of ATP. Number 25, what is the primary purpose of lipids? They have a lot of cool purposes. The primary one I want you to focus on is they are long-term energy storage. So any extra calories that you were to ingest, usually those are converted into fat storage within the body. Now, if you ever are in a carbohydrate deficit, meaning you haven't had enough carbs, your cells don't have enough glucose to do cellular respiration to make energy, then your body will start breaking down those lipids that you've stored up as like a backup energy source. So lipids are great for long-term energy storage. Number 26, if someone was on a low-carb diet, how would their cells produce energy they need, since carbohydrates, specifically glucose, are used in cellular respiration to make ATP or energy in our cells? So think about the 3 elements that are in glucose: CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Okay, so a compound made of those 3 elements is necessary to do cellular respiration. So let's say someone's on a low-carb diet. They're not taking in enough glucose for your cells to do cellular respiration to make energy. So what's your body going to do? You're just going to keel over? No. It's going to use some other macromolecules that also have CHO in order to perform that function, in order to still do cellular respiration. So lipids are a great backup to carbohydrates, like we just talked about in number 25. Lipids are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So they can also be used to make energy for our cells. Proteins can as well, but it also has that extra nitrogen that isn't necessarily great if that were to build up in your body. So in dire straits, if you're on a low carb diet, your cells will rely on the stored up fat tissue, stored up lipids to still do cellular respiration. And as that fat goes away because it's being used to make energy, that's what causes you to lose weight. All right. So if you guys have any questions about this, feel free to email me, and good luck on your test.